Thank you so much for having me. So I could never really understand what the role of a discussant is, although I work in this environment. And I always thought it's sort of artificial to add somebody to be between the speaker and the discussion, because what is that person going to really add? Anyway, so I'll just add a bit of, a hymn to the speaker, whom I've known a long time, but also, because I'm always about framing and contextualizing, there's a lot of breathlessness in what we just heard and read. And when we instill that, or when we pass it on to our students, then I just worry about them. I already worry about them now, but I worry more if we also make them more anxious than they already are, because they're already overwhelmed, as we are, from these news all the time that just come incessantly. And so this book doesn't say enough about how somebody like Eve Darian-Smith got there, which actually requires a lot of patience and actually a lot of long-term close looking. And that's only what I just want to point out a little. Okay. So the world that Professor Darian-Smith describes is one of breathlessness. The loss of oxygen is caused quite literally by fire, and concretely by the fires she depicts in different parts of the world, which she then contextualizes. Through this contextualization, she renders visible what it is that we lost in the fire, but also how distant many of us are from the we that is actually seeing their livelihood, their way of living in community with humans and nature consumed in the fire. But it's not just anthropology and the patience of an ethnographer which allow her to bring together very local narratives through which we can see similarities and connections. It's also her keen interest in making sense of the conditions that have led us up to the present moment. There's much that is lost in the fire that rages through villages, communities, and democracies, and that's her metaphorical use of the fire. But of course, it's also literal. She's at the same time not the only one who most recently again uses the metaphor of fire to depict fire's insatiable, all-consuming character, its velocity of eruption and expansion, and the futility to contain or distinguish certain kinds of fire. Ben Buchanan and Andrew Ilbery, in their new book, The New Fire, also published the same year, use the metaphor of fire to depict the nature and impact of artificial intelligence in transforming, displacing, and expropriating already fragile practices of exercising collective agency. Using imageries or metaphors are choices. They speak to illustrating, highlighting examples, or to telling an entire story. This brings us to the how. The how we talk about problems and other things, and how we define problems in the first space. I don't know anymore. I would know. Anyway, so we don't have time, but I wanted to share a little what we all do. I guess we try to read the things that explain the moment we live in. And so the connections that are made in her book are connections that many people struggle with right now. And I just want to make a plea that we should actually try to not just spend it online and read in a frantic, breathless way, jump from one, I like this, I like that, to the other, but actually take time to read books from beginning to end. The bigger the problems, the more important does the approach of showing your reader how you do your work and how you actually come to define problems becomes. The angrier, the more infuriated or disillusioned we might have become, even more so over the past few years, the greater must be our effort to open our toolbox to our readers for outside inspection and challenge. When I read Global Burning last year, I felt that this book is even more an invitation to reflect on what we are doing than what I had read myself with students by Professor Darian-Smith in the past. The stakes in this book particularly are overwhelmingly high. That offers a combination of shocking snapshots, intimate narratives of catastrophe and suffering, with the raising of pertinent questions and hypotheses of how such a state of things has been evolving over too long. Reading her book provided for me a couple of hours of concentrating on just one thing, and at the same time being torn again and again to get up and open up and finish another thing that I had meant to read out of a sense that almost felt existential, a sense to stop the franticness in which I was caught at the same time and counter the anxiety that has taken hold of so many of us. In this climate of restlessness, I find that reading your colleagues, your friends, or some strangers' authored book gives brief respite from the madness and violence. I try reading every book to its end for two reasons. One being so that I never have to say, so-and-so's book, yeah, great, I read that, when I never did, or worse, to be saying, I will have a look at that. Or worse still, I had a look at it. The other one is that everything, including so-called public discourse, moves so fast, feels so random and disingenuous that reading someone's text from beginning to end slows it all down and recreates the conversation with somebody thoughtful that itself is becoming so rare, it seems. Global Burning was such a book for me. Reading it felt like being in an open conversation with someone who is highly informed and highly effective, and having us both think about the challenge of how to connect conceptually and pragmatically in a spirit of transformative political practice, climate change with the transformation of political processes during the predicament of Western arrogant human rights and of historian myopia, parochialism and elitism of the late 20th century, and our inability of over 50 years or more to stop, effectively counter, or today perhaps reverse the financialization of our lives. This predicament is even worse as we're coming so terribly late to recognize how, caught up with our own privileged preoccupation with what we call state transformation as European scholars, in an era of globalization in the 80s and 90s, that we had all the time been abusively dismissive to the long-standing claims of global South scholars and people to acknowledge the power asymmetries that our European post-war mindset helped perpetuate and deepen. Climate change critique is very much at the heart of this realization today, which is why we must listen attentively to Professor Darian-Smith's call for a political practice that is able to provincialize its dearly held preoccupations and what it thinks are the problem. She invites us to think beyond our own cute critique of neoliberalism and how we allow it to give evil corporations power in a mania of privatization and market rule. Her proposal is to think outside that bubble and to finally recognize the parochialism of these particular anxieties in order to face the fact that we chose not to acknowledge far too long the cannibal capitalism, that's one of the references of current books, Nancy Fraser's recent book, type of degradation, dehumanization, exploitation we inflicted on those who had and have to pay for our, another quote, imperial mode of living. I could actually just leave it at that. Yeah,